So, good evening. We are going to discuss this evening the topic of civil society activism and democracy, and I will just take a few minutes to introduce you to the topic. So, first of all, thanks to the NYU for hosting this. Actually, this event was possible because I got a small fund from New York University in New York, which is called Global Faculty Fund, which helped me also to organize this conference. And I could invite for colleagues and friends Angela Gennaro. She's a campaigner for change.org that you already know since we mentioned it many times during our classes. Jamal Shaheen is a professor in two universities, in Amsterdam and the Vrije Universiteit, which is the Flemish pronunciation of university in Brussels, which means free university. Vigilanza Abbasi, we met in Amsterdam when she was a PhD student. Now she's a postdoc in the University of Maastricht. And Giulio Carini, so those are the two scholars. Angela is a campaigner, and Giulio Carini is again a campaigner for, at the moment, Riparte il Futuro, which is an Italian initiative, you will tell us more, about transparency of public administration. The idea is to have two scholars and two civil society activists to explain you their experiences and to challenge themselves in this topic. We will start with Jamal, then we will have Angela, then Vigilanza, and last but not least, Giulio. So thank you, Jamal. I will leave you the floor.
Thank you. Is this, yes, this is working. Good. Good evening. Thank you very much, Gianluca. Thank you very much. The La Pietra dialogues. I was trying to say that in Italian, that doesn't work. I don't know how the weather was yesterday, but I think I brought some rain with me this morning. The pilot on the plane, you know when pilots talk on the plane and they say good welcome on the flight and everything, he said we were 30 degrees and we all had 30 degrees, and so I was taking my suit off and then I realized he meant 13. So, sorry about that. I'll take it home with me tomorrow. But I'm here to talk about civil society and democracy. And that's two big topics. One, when you put them together, it's one even bigger topic. And I've been trying to make a talk that would go around 3 points. It didn't work, so I have two sets of 2 points, which is not 4 points. Okay. But we'll start from the beginning. I want to start with some premises, some observations, and some little assumptions about what's going on in the world. Democracy is evolving. Democracy is evolving. Things are changing in the world of democracy. And civil society is evolving as well. Those are the two premises that I want to start the dialogue with you and the people in the back there. They're still coming in. So those are the two premises that I'd like to kind of start the ball rolling with. I think you can see this in different ways, and I want to highlight some of them. There's more apathy in political activity. I'm looking at everybody around me and thinking what they're thinking. There's more apathy in political activity, seen notably in the downturn in participation or turnout in elections. Right? There's also a lack of understanding from both citizens and politicians about what different roles are that should be played in these areas. I think those are two things that I'm making them as statements, but I'm making these, in fact, to start a dialogue. And in fact, the whole of my conversation is about starting this dialogue. I'm not giving you answers, I'm giving you positions from which we can then start talking. I want to talk specifically about one study that we carried out in one of my institutes where I work for a European institution called the European Economic and Social Committee. It's an organization that deals with what they call civil society and what most people call organized civil society, because it's civil society that has very specific roles in terms of policy making, in terms of interaction with policymakers. Right? And this study highlighted several little issues about the way that civil society works in democracy. And it was particularly oriented towards political life after the financial crisis, or after the onset of the financial crisis. Does anybody know when the financial crisis first kicked off? And if you say 1973, I'll give you extra points. When was the year when everything started going really badly in the world financially? Are you used to 2008? Yes, that's right. So the study was commissioned a few years after that to actually look into what kind of challenges civil society organizations were actually facing in their countries, or in Europe as a whole. And there are several things that came out of that that I think are important, and I think, having had a discussion with some of the other people on the panel, maybe need to be taken up a bit further. One of them is that a lot of things that government used to do, right, and this might not just be because of the crisis, this might be a more neoliberal vision of what government should look like, but a lot of what government used to do is actually being outsourced. Right? And civil society are either given the role of taking this on, or are left to pick up the pieces when government doesn't provide particular services. Right? Another thing that's very specific is that money is scarce. Right? There is less money floating around for civil society to actually carry out activities. And what money is there actually is allocated from different departments to the ones it used to be allocated from. So the Ministry of Culture, or the Department of Culture, or whichever, might have had, in previous years, a budget where it could give to specific civil society organizations to allow them to carry out activities. Those civil society organizations would be talking to people in ministries that know about culture. Right? Now, a lot of the funding for civil society organizations comes from ministries of economics or finance ministries, right? The discourse that those people have is very different to the discourse that comes out of the Ministry of Culture, okay? So you have this different kind of way in which money is being distributed. People talk about return on investment. You know what that is? ROI? You will learn what ROI is. And they talk about performance reviews. They talk about all of these kinds of technical terms that actually have nothing to do with making the world a better place, unless you're an economist. That change in the discourse of the people who are giving out the money has actually changed the way, and this is where civil society is evolving, has changed the way that civil society presents itself to the bureaucrats and the legislators. In some contexts, and in fact in our study we found that a lot of the legislators and the bureaucrats actually like to talk about professionalization of civil society. I find that a bit harsh as a term, because I don't think, you know, experts need to be considered as unprofessional, but they talk about this professionalization of civil society organizations, which actually allow them to bring funding in a certain area. And I'm already over my 10 minutes, I guess. No. Another thing that's happened, as money is scarce, right, and as discourse needs to change, is that you tend to have more coalitions arriving. I think we're going to hear about partnerships later on, right? But one of the things that's very interesting is then you get coalitions of civil society organizations emerging that maybe you'd say, why are you working together? You have different aims, you have different goals, right? And then it becomes more about the projects that get funding rather than the objectives or the goals of that civil society organization. So service provision is being outsourced, money is scarce, the discourse is changing, and the coalitions, different partnerships, different constellations of civil society organizations are now emerging. Right? Another very important thing that's emerging, and we've heard that there are some differences in different countries across the EU and probably across the world, is that the interface, or civil society is becoming the interface between legislators and bureaucrats and citizens. Right? They're interpreting what legislators and bureaucrats are doing and telling citizens whether that's good or bad or not. Right? I think that's something that needs to be discussed a bit more. I'm posting it in very plain terms. It needs a bit more nuance, right? Those were some of the findings that we came out with from our study that we did. And since then, I've been doing quite a bit of work in the field. And I've come across some more observations. I just want to give you one more before I conclude. The other one thing that I want to say is that at the European level, which is what I'm most familiar with, I guess this happens at national levels as well, but at the European level, you have a lot more interest in what's called stakeholder engagement, right? Involving experts, academics, civil society organizations, industry representatives, and so on, in the design of policy at a very early stage. Now that means that these civil society organizations are actually becoming part of the team of people, if you like, the stakeholders, that are actually contributing to policy design and not necessarily contributing simply to opening up a debate between policies and their implications, but actually helping shape the policies in the first place. Now that, to me, holds very interesting, and depends whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, it holds very interesting consequences for democracy, the role of representative democracy, and the role of the legislators and the representatives that we have, and how they play and how they interact with the integration of civil society organizations along with all these different types of stakeholders into policy design. That's a bit abstract, maybe. What I'm trying to say there is that there's a challenge for our understanding of democracy to make it actually make sense when you engage with these different actors in policy design and not later on in the policy process. I guess it still happens. Reintermediation is another word. If you come out with like 4 words from one word from each person, my word would be not reintermediation, it would be the fluid nature of politics, but I get to that in a minute. I want to talk about reintermediation first. That is exactly what I was talking about before. That's the key word that I forgot to say, that civil society involved in this area of policy design is becoming these reintermediators, if you like. Not disintermediators, not intermediators, but reintermediation. My concluding point, I think, because I should wrap up, I want to kind of draw your attention to what I think is the consequence of all of this, right? The consequence and the cause of all of this, which is, I think, this fluid nature of politics, okay? Politics is moving from being something that has been more about ideology, if you like, and so on, to something that is much more time-limited, time-dependent. It's much more about specific issues. It's much more about building up coalitions. It's a far more flexible way of thinking about politics. And I think that this discourse between civil society, activism, democracy, and particularly new technologies that we'll talk about next, actually bring this kind of fluid nature of politics to the fore. So, thank you.
My name is Angela Gennaro. I am a campaigner here in Italy for Change.org. Our headquarters are based in Rome. I have a couple of slides for you, nothing very boring, but just to give me, I will, to give you some support to follow my speech. First of all, how many people in this room know change.org? Okay. And how many people in this room have signed the petition on change.org? Okay. And how many people in this room have started a petition on change.org? Okay, we still need to work. I will begin with the first question, a rhetoric question. What do the United States, Mexico, and Italy have in common? You can say nothing, you can say a lot of things. Today I want to analyze with you a very specific thing, which is a new shape of democracy that we are experiencing with change.org and the global arena where people are actually trying to change the things they want to change. Few words on change.org for the few ones who are not a pro on that, and few figures. Is a platform, neutral platform, international platform on which everyone can start a campaign, mobilize supporter, and drive solutions with the decision makers. We have started in 2007 in the United States in San Francisco. We have arrived in Italy in 2012. Nearly, in this moment, 150 million of people, almost, quite less, but almost, are taking action, signing, starting petitions, sharing, just commenting, doing something on change.org. And nearly every hour, a petition on change.org achieves victory for a total of 17,500 something total of victories in 196 countries. In Italy, we have achieved a milestone of 5 million users a couple of months ago. Now we have 5 million and a half, and 600 victories so far. So we were talking about the United States because change.org is not just a question of campaigning, but it's becoming a question of social reputation too. In the United States, and as you know, the political moment is very hot, of course. We decided to launch this new tool, which is called Change Politics. Change Politics empower voters to make confident voting decision by sourcing candidate recommendation from the people they trust most. It's actually a platform where people can make endorsement, share endorsement. This will create, let's say, the result is a new kind of political influencer who is not the journalist, the opinionist, is not the politician, the party affiliation, but it's you, it's us. It's the normal, ordinary voter. And an imaginary, a virtual world in which election outcomes are determined by voters armed with information from their trust networks. Rather than, we said, the political affiliation ads or something like that. So every voter has the ability to, this is just a screenshot of the website with your protagonist. So you can, source the recommendation from friends, family, neighborhood leaders, your celebrities. If you trust a celebrity, why don't get a recommendation from your celebrity? Given the chance to make a more informed voting decision. In this way, this tool is trying to build a reputation system for democracy. It's trying to bridge in the gap between people, ordinary people, and who are voters, actually, and politicians and power sources. And it's putting the voter's voice at the center of the debate and the process of the election. We, from United States, and we're speaking of United States and Europe too, she's Jaha Dukure. I've seen something unbelievable happening in last month. She is an activist, a survivor activist. She tells her own story. I want to read it with you. As an infant growing up in Gambia, I experienced female genital mutilation. It took away a part of my femininity, my ownership to my body. Some girls, including my half-sister, who died from complication from being cut, even lose their lives. When I was 15 years old, I moved to New York and was forced into marriage. I was lucky to escape and create a new life in Atlanta, where I now live with my second husband and children. I ended my silence about my experience and started speaking out about FGM. Now I am committed, Jaha says, to ending this destructive practice all over the world, and we have already created a global movement that has achieved some great results in the UK, in the United States and Gambia. When she talks about the movement, she's actually right. She is building a global movement, and she will tell you by herself.
Jaha Dukure, and I am a survivor of female genital mutilation. When The Guardian came on board, we went from 10 signatures a day to thousands of signatures a day. I'm not going to let I'm not going to let, fear deter me from doing anything.
So Jaha nomination from Time, was something unbelievable, and tells the beautiful story of how our platform helps someone realize the change, try to realize the change they want to see in the world. And if I have to tell you a key word, to me is empowerment, and she is absolutely the real example with a well-deserved recognition. From Atlanta to Mexico, because when there is a very engaging issue being discussed publicly, for example, a new constitution or a law, Change.org may be a unique and powerful way to let people raise their proposal and voices about it. Mexico City just launched after a change in their municipality. Have launched this, I don't know Spanish, so it's Constitución something. An article on Quartz defined this a massive experiment in digital democracy. So the municipality is actually asking all the 9 million residents of the city to help draft the new constitution. They have to write, to realize through social media, from social networks. This is something unprecedented in Mexico and so far anywhere else. So local can, through change.org, petition for issues they want to be included in the new constitution. And there is a mechanism. When a petition reaches 5,000 signatures, the Constitutional Technical Secretary, which is actually writing the Constitution, will respond to this petition through the website, through change.org, with a through their verified profile as decision makers. If a petition hits the 10,000 signatures, the 3 representatives from the group of writers of the Constitution will meet in person the petition starters of this petition to present to talk about this initiative. And if a petition hits the 50,000 signatures, which is not always easy, of course. The whole group of writers, the whole group who's writing the Constitution, will meet the petition starters in person to pitch their proposal. So this public open consultation experiment is, of course, a big test. It's a big test for us, but is a big test for all of us, for us as Change.org, but for all of us as people and for people's digital power. The mechanisms were launched at the end of March and will collect proposals until September the 1st. The new constitution is waited to be approved and voted by the end of January. Last but not least, home, Italy. I don't know if you know, but in June we will have elections, small and big Italian cities going to elections to elect new administrations and new mayors. We are seeing in Italy, as usual, changes of strategies and nominations, replacement of candidates, all this kind of stuff that we know very well, but we are not really seeing the electoral programs of the candidates. The news is that the citizens are writing these programs, are proposing these programs. We have the citizens, we have movement pages from 5 big cities. I just put here 3 of them, but for example, Rome will go to election, Milan, Turin, Bologna, Naples. We have the citizens of these big municipalities who have drawn up a real electoral program, petitioning the candidates, and in this way they are petitioning the future mayors too with their proposals. And they are articulated proposals or very simple proposals, ordinary problems, everyday problems for public transport, healthcare, social services, archaeological sites for Rome, for everywhere here in Italy. It's another giant experiment in participation through technology, and it's something absolutely new, we have to say, in Italy. All the candidates, of course, will be able to answer with the decision maker verified profile in a direct, transparent, and unfiltered way to the petition starters and their signers. We have to say that you know that our Prime Minister, he is I pick him as an example because he is very well known and he is a very pro Twitter user, for example. He decided to launch this experiment on Twitter, on the social networks, launched the hashtag Matteo Risponde. It's 65 minutes in which he answers to questions from people through social media. From some observers, this is just a paced monologue, because Premier answering in this way, of course, is choosing the questions. It's just answering once. On Change.org you can answer and then you get the answer back from the petition starters and the signers. The debate can go on. It can decide, the politician in general, can decide if answer, what handle. Sometimes, unfortunately, they do this very superficially. I think this is the right occasion to start a real discussion between people and institutions. So far, we just have one candidate who decided to be on Change.org answering petitions and joining the party. If they are ready or not, this is the way things are changing. So we are waiting for them. Of course, we have invited all of them, and we are sure we will come sooner or later.
Good evening on my part as well. Thank you, Gianluca, a lot for your kind invitation. And to the dialogues, I'm very pleased to be here. Actually, it was a long detour to come and arrive, although I'm just at the Badia at the UI at the moment. But anyway, it was nice to go to La Cura and do some circles. So it's actually my presentation, my talk today fits very neatly after what's been said, sort of a bit of more critical thinking and critical questions, and more of civil actors pushing boundaries on the ground. But what I want to take you from is from on the ground and from the digital world to the courtroom. So I hope you will bear with a lawyer in this panel. My sort of the gist of my message today, and I focus specifically in the context of the European Union, is to show you, is to answer, sort of to say that civil actors have changed transparency in the European Union. They actually have made the European Union more transparent. And when I talk about transparency, of course, maybe for some of you, the first thing that comes to mind is not public access requests, which is something I'm focusing on tonight, but perhaps you will think of leaks, which are quite popular at the moment in our debates. And actually, just even today, Greenpeace Netherlands leaked the latest documents for the EU-US TTIP discussion, and I encourage you all to just go and have a look because they're very well presented and you can see what's going on. Or, for example, State Watch, which is an NGO based in the UK, has been leaking a lot of information when it came to the refugee crisis and specifically the EU-Turkey agreement. Leaks are very important, of course, not even to mention the Panama Papers or LuxLeaks for tax evasion. But what I want to focus, and the reason why I do so on public access requests, or what in the US law would be known as Freedom of Information Act, is because it's not only important to change things in practice, it's important to push the boundaries in law and to change the legal requirements for specifically for public administration to what they're bound to do. In the European Union, for a long time, actually, private actors, civil society actors, have been quite active. And one of the earliest examples of a case that was brought by a Swedish journalist association is in 1998. And what's interesting, at that time, sort of Sweden joined the European Union, and Sweden prouds itself for being a very transparent country. And they said, why don't we do this experiment where we ask the same documents from our national ministry, and we ask the same documents to the Council, which is this body in the EU that joins all the ministers from all members of the European Union. And it's funny because they asked 20 documents. In Sweden, they received 18, and only 2 were refused. In the European Union, only 2 were granted, and the rest of 18 were refused. And then the Council sort of reconsidered its decision and later gave 2 more. And sort of for the rest, they said, no, these are very sensitive information. We cannot share them with you. So, of course, this association decided to take the issue further and took it to the court, the European Court of Justice, which actually made one of the most significant rulings at the time, saying that the principle of access to information in the European Union has this fundamental basics of being as wide as possible. So the message here in this first case, in this first example, is trying to say that the way this access information is going to apply is not the minimal level, but the maximum level. So it sort of changes this idea of legal requirement for the institutions to what extent they're justified to give answers to these requests. So sort of that's the important, and this is already 1998, which, I mean, I don't know to what extent you generally even care about the EU, but at the time it was still even more of a diplomatic overall body and thinking that it could be considered today, where principles like democracy, representative democracy, or citizens' initiative are actually enshrined in primary law, in the treaties, and what European lawyers call constitutional EU laws. So sort of that's very important. The second example, it's a more recent example. It's an access information request from Access Info Europe, which is interesting because actually this organization really embodies this idea of civil activism in European Union, and particularly when it comes to transparency, because they are specifically established to change transparency in the EU. And the reason why they were established in Spain is because Spain was the only member state that did not have freedom of information laws. So they really wanted to push both the EU and national level culture of transparency. Now, what happened there in this case is very interesting because the way law sometimes is made in the European Union is that member states have their positions that they give in the working parties, but they don't want their identity to be disclosed because they don't want sort of their own citizens to know what they're dealing with at the EU level. And we have examples like the Dutch minister on migration agreeing something at the council level, saying yes, then going to national press and saying, oh, I was outvoted. I actually wanted to say no. I said no. And then if you have access to this information, you can actually see that this person is straight out lying because actually the position was yes, straight on. Anyway, so what Access Info Europe wanted was access to information about how legislation is made, and they wanted to have the identity of the member states who are putting forth these positions as well. So what the council did is gave these documents, but still blacked out the name of the member states. And the court here again comes in and says, no, this is actually lawmaking. And you cannot have lawmaking in secret. That just does not work when you have a democracy and want to bind citizens directly. Hence, the positions of the member states have to be identified with the member state. Now, I don't know if there's any lawyer in the room, but some of you might contest me in saying, can you actually claim that this is the work of the civil society? Isn't this the court pushing the boundary further? But because it is the interpretation of the court to understand access to information in this way. And my saying to you there would be that these cases wouldn't be brought to the court in the first place if these actors don't actively work and actually are very persistent and very strategic into their access requests, into filing cases, into hiring top-notch lawyers in order to argue the best as they can to actually push transparency forward. And I don't want to make it sound as if it's all milk and honey. Of course, there's cases where actors are not so successful. For example, Client Earth, which is another NGO that works a lot on environmental issues, was filing information requests to check whether member states are actually complying with European law, environmental law. And that case actually was sort of a failure because they didn't actually get the documents, and the court says there's a margin of discretion here. So it didn't end up as they had sort of strategically wanted it to do. However, and this is sort of the academic in me that wants to balance the perspective comes into play. Is it all so great when we talk about civil society? It's not the point today for us to all agree and nod that they're doing a great job. I think the basic premise that we can say is yes, generally perhaps they are. And I'm showing you through exact concrete examples that they are changing things for the good in European Union. However, I think we should also go beyond the courtroom and look not on the ground, but more on a theoretical level and sort of map and look at more critically at what are the actors actually doing. And I don't want to, my point here is not to address a big normative question on whether their role is desirable, whether they make democracy better or not. Do they actually contribute? Is it selective? Who's on Twitter? Maybe 18-year-olds, not so much my grandma. So there can be critical questions there, but so I'm not engaging with those. But what I want to ask is more broadly and perhaps specific to the EU is sort of this vertical relation of the NGO, sort of the civil society sector with the citizens and the Commission in particular, and the more horizontal level, so their relations among themselves. And I'm going to pose a lot of questions, and I hope you remember at least some of them because I would like to actually discuss them more actively with you during the discussion session. What I mean with the relations with the Commission, I think some of the questions that we really need to ask is how does the dependency of funds by the Commission affect these civil society actors? Because in the Brussels bubble, they're actually getting money from the Commission in order to influence the Commission. So we have to think about where the money is flowing. In the case of the ministries, that's one thing, but in the case of the EU, it's coming from the same actors that these NGOs want to influence. Secondly, to what extent are these actors just mirroring EU institutions as such in terms of being elitist, and to what extent they actually reflect interests and questions that matter to ordinary citizens? How do we know if they're actually defending an interest from a citizen in Malta and maybe not so much just NGOs that are bigger and have more money and for interests that only people, let's say, in Paris or London care about? Secondly, so those are sort of the two key points of money and interest when we talk about the vertical relation. Whereas when we talk about the horizontal layer of how they engage with each other, I think we often look at civil society as a homogeneous group and they're all great and they're all fighting for the same normative values of democracy, transparency. But is that actually so? So my critical questions here are, who are the actors that actually matter? What are the actors that are marginalized? What are the disparities between splits of West and East in Europe or South and North? And what are the interests that are most at stake? And how do these actors compete among each other? in the second sort of the horizontal layer, what matters a lot is sort of who matters, who doesn't, who decides, and how does the competition between these actors actually work. So to sum up, what I want you to really remember is not unfortunately a word, but it's more of a sentence. Transparency matters, and civil society actors have actually influenced how transparency works in the EU. But it's also very important that we're critical at their overall role, not just as change makers, but as an object, as an actor within the field of governance more broadly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Gianluca for inviting me. And I'm really happy to be here because I want to share the experiences that I have as a civil society activist. And hopefully it's a room of potential future activists. So I'm really happy to be here. So first, I want to give you a bit of background about my experience because it's a bit unorthodox, both in how I grew up and also my path to being an activist. So as you can tell, I have an American accent. That's because, but my name is Giulio Carini. But that's because I grew up half of my life in Italy and the other half in the US. I have Italian parents, and then as an adolescent, I moved to the US and I studied there. I went to university and law school, and then I worked in New York City for a big law firm. Now I entered law school with very noble, very noble ideas and fighting for social justice. But as I'm sure potentially some of you can relate, obviously there was lots of debts I had to go into and I had to pay those back. So I ended up working in the big law industry in New York City for a few years. And there I worked really by chance in the oil industry. And we represented Hugo Chavez and PDVSA, the state oil company of Venezuela. I worked on 2 years on the fact that Hugo Chavez decided to nationalize or renationalize the oil industry. And what it meant was that foreign oil companies that had agreements with PDVSA had to either renegotiate all of their joint ventures or get out. Some of them decided to sue in arbitration, others decided to renegotiate. And I worked 2 years in New York City on renegotiating all these contracts, and I became an expert really in the oil industry and how oil contracts work. Now after that, the financial crisis happened, and I was laid off, and I had luckily paid off most of my debt, and I decided that I really wanted to go back to my initial ideal of becoming a lawyer and fighting for social justice and pursue my noble intentions. And I realized that it was very difficult to actually do in the law field, and I decided to get a master's in London at King's College in the War Studies department and try to work for an NGO and work for something that I believed in. And so I was lucky enough to use all the experience that I had in the oil industry, and that's why I'm telling you this as well, to work for Global Witness, which is a British NGO that works to promote transparency in the natural resource sector. You probably know the movie Blood Diamonds with Leonardo DiCaprio. So that research for that movie is based on the research from Global Witness, which comes from an investigation by the founders of Global Witness in Angola, linking diamonds to the conflict and the civil war there. So I ended up working at Global Witness for several years as a campaigner. And I'm going to really talk a lot about my experience there, the lessons that I've learned. And now I work for an Italian organization called Riparte il Futuro, which means restarting the future, which is about promoting transparency in Italy and trying to reduce corruption, because I'm not sure, you probably have read that Italy is generally known for being one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. So I've decided to come back from London, where I was a Global Witness, to Rome to work on issues related to corruption and transparency. And I want to really just give you 3 lessons that I've learned from my experience as a civil society activist. One of them is, where does change come from? It's a very daunting question, but I'll try to make it simple. And then the other point is, don't just ask the why, feel the why. And the third point, which I think is very relevant and extremely practical, is who should I partner with if I'm a civil society activist? So starting off, where does change come from? You know, as an activist, your main goal is to change things, to create change. So it's reasonable to ask ourselves, how do we achieve change and where does it come from? Obviously, it depends on the specific case, but a lesson that I've learned from my experience as a civil society activist is that change rarely happens in one stroke through a great revelation by one activity, one action. Change takes a long time to evolve. It needs time to incubate and spends a lot of its time in standby. So change generally comes from the collision of smaller achievements that, when grouped together, bring about the awareness conditions for a paradigm shift. So a full vision of change will generally not be possible in the short or medium term. Your vision needs to operate in a more partial, limited, piecemeal form. And so the point as activists, as potentially future activists, is that we try not to demotivate yourself if you have to achieve a piecemeal, smaller achievement, because those are necessary to set up the conditions for your long-term theory of change. So that was quite abstract, but let me give you an example based on my experience. So as I said, I was a lawyer before. I transitioned to being an activist after the master's in London, and in 2009, I was lucky to join Global Witness, and I worked on the Publish What You Pay campaign, which had started all the way back in 2002, and it was a coalition of civil society organizations. We had talked about, Jamal had mentioned that civil society organizations, the coalitions are becoming more prevalent, and this is definitely an example of one. It was a group of, I believe, more than 50 civil society groups from all over the world, and their aim was to require extractive companies, oil, gas, mineral companies, to disclose all the payments they make to governments where they operate. So if Shell operates in Nigeria, they need to publicly disclose the payments they make in Nigeria. Now, this was a very piecemeal part. This campaign was very piecemeal of what we wanted in terms of transparency in the extractive sector. We wanted to ensure that governments were held accountable for the revenues they receive from extractive companies. And so that civil society in oil-rich countries like Nigeria, Angola, later on Libya, could see that their governments received billions and then demand that this money be used for development and to improve their lives. But the Publish What You Pay campaign would be a very small step in achieving this goal. The campaign would only give you how much publicly listed companies, and not state companies or private companies, were paying governments. So, more importantly, it didn't give you the full budget of how much governments got and where they spent the money, which was our goal, is trying to hold governments to account for the money that they received. You have to know the budgets and you have to know where the money is spent. But that was not the Publish What You Pay campaign. And despite the fact that at the time, Bono from U2 called the campaign a game changer, the Publish What You Pay campaign really was only a very small step, as I said before, to full government transparency. So I spent 2 years working on this campaign. And at the time, I thought we weren't achieving anything. It was a real struggle for me to keep motivation on this campaign that I thought didn't really have that change, that vision of change that I was envisioning. But now, as I sit here in hindsight, I realized that it was part of the puzzle. It established the conditions for change, and that was enough. Even though I knew it would not achieve our ultimate goal, transparency in the extractive sector as a result of the Publish What You Pay campaign became part of the public consciousness and discourse in a much bigger way, especially in the US and the European Union. And in fact, later on in 2011, the Open Government Partnership Initiative was established, and budget transparency became a priority for many resource-rich countries. So that's my first point about change. Where does it come from it really comes incrementally. It's through a number of small achievements. And it's important not to be demotivate yourself if that ultimate goal isn't reached in the short or medium term. The second point from my experience is I put it as, don't just ask the why, feel the why. And this comes from a great TED Talk that you should look up, which is Start with the Why. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but basically it's more about companies in the corporate world, and it talks about how companies that have been successful start with the why and not the what and not the how. So Apple starts with the why, and it's been very successful. It has a belief, it has a cause, it has, we want to make something simple that's accessible to everybody. And that's what they start with, and that's why they're successful. So by the why, I mean this. What is the purpose? What is the cause? What is the belief? And while in the corporate world that's not always the case, that people start with the why, I think that NGOs, that's why people go and work for them. They want to start with the why. What's the purpose of why I'm doing this? What's the cause? What's the belief in what you're doing? But the thing that I've learned from my experience is that to sustain motivation, that's not enough. It's not enough to start with the why, that purpose, cause, and belief that you have. But you also need to feel the why. It needs to be an issue or a vision of change that is personal to you, that you have become attached to, and that you feel is yours. And to do so usually requires that that purpose, that belief personally impacts you, that you have a stake in the result. So again, let me give you an example from my own experience to illustrate this. When I was working at Global Witness, I went to Libya during the civil war in 2011, during the Arab Spring. I went on a scoping mission with the director of Global Witness to gauge whether the new temporary government was interested in transparency measures in the oil industry, especially because Libya is a country with 6 million people, and at the time it had 60 billion worth of revenues from the oil industry. So it was a very big issue, the issue of transparency in the oil industry in Libya. And it was a very special time in 2011 in Libya. Everyone was bursting with hope to topple an oppressive dictator and bring about democracy. And also the temporary government there, they were very welcoming to us and other Western NGOs, and they're very keen to listen to our recommendations about transparency in the extractive sector. And we met with several ministers, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance. We had unbelievable access. We developed relationships with civil society groups that were just emerging. During the Gaddafi regime, civil society was illegal. You could not be part of a civil society group. So because there was a burst of hope and a beginning of democracy, they were very open to us. At the same time, no one at Global Witness spoke Arabic. And we had very little knowledge of the social, political context of Libya. More importantly, we didn't have a personal stake in the outcome for Libya, other than sound bites from Western media. And in fact, after less than a year, when the media lost interest in Libya, so did we. The situation slowly deteriorated in the country, and we decided to pull out. We didn't continue our campaign, not from our office in London. We didn't have any long-term strategy, and we didn't have any strategy if the security situation improved. We just pulled out. So obviously security played a major role in the decision to leave and stop our campaign. But I think what really the issue was is that we couldn't sustain our motivation to be there. We had no long-term approach to this campaign because we didn't feel the why. We had no personal stake in the outcome. So this is one of the lessons that I've learned from my experience as an activist, is that before starting a project, make sure to ask yourself not just the why, but ask yourself if you feel the why. In order to sustain motivation and achieve that change, which, as I mentioned before, is often achieved only in the long term with a dedicated strategy. And this takes me to where I am now. I've decided to come back to Italy to work for Riparte il Futuro because I feel the why. I feel attached to the campaigns that I'm working on. I feel that the efforts that I provide to the campaigns will then, I have a personal stake in those campaigns. So if we do achieve transparency in Italy, and if we do, for instance, are able to pass Freedom of Information Act that we're working on, then it affects me personally. I can then go and ask the government for information and to have access to various information. And it kind of goes back exactly to what you were talking about. Just wanted to add, Jamal was talking about how now civil society is also involved in policy design. And with the FOIA action that we're taking, we're presenting ourselves to the government with our recommendations, with our very technical policy design, and at this moment in time, they're potentially listening to us. So anyway, that's my second point, really about you have to feel the why. Don't just ask the why, but have a personal stake in order to sustain that motivation. And then the final point is, who should I partner with? It's very difficult to find, I found it very difficult to find other civil society groups that have the same vision as you, and you often have to make a compromise in how you present yourself and with what goals you present yourself with. But I think the 2 points that I mentioned before are a very good way to finding a partner, a civil society partner that you can work with on your campaigns. And really it's about, do they have the same vision of change that you do in terms of what I talked about before? Are they flexible with change? Do they understand that change happens with smaller achievements and not all in one activity? Are they willing to compromise with the possibility that they're not going to get everything that they set out to, at least in the short or medium term? And then another way that I think of when I think about choosing a partner is, again, I try to find other partners who also feel the why, who have a personal stake in the issue so they can sustain their motivation. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you for your presentations. As you can see, scholars try to understand phenomena and frame it in a way that could be understandable, and they also ask questions. And practitioners, activists, try to motivate themselves and explain what they do. So I would like to know